What if time itself tried to tear them apart? Have you ever wondered? What if love didn't come from your heart, but from a distant star? Could you fall for someone that isn't even human? Would love survive the overwhelming differences, or would it be destroyed by the vastness of space? In the quiet of a lonely night, when the stars above were twinkling like secrets, I received a message, one that would change everything. It wasn't from a friend, nor from anyone I knew. It came from somewhere else, somewhere I could never have imagined. It came from beyond our world, from the depths of space itself. And it was then, in the middle of all the confusion, that I realized I was no longer living in the world I once knew. What followed was not just a love story, but an exploration of whether two worlds, two souls could ever truly unite. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens next is a journey filled with discoveries. Not just about love, but about the very fabric of the universe. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible adventure. And leave a comment below to share your thoughts. The planet Ilarion was a world unlike any Kian had ever seen. The landscape was barren, stretching into infinity, with jagged crystal formations rising from the ground like natural sculptures. The sky, a deep violet hue, bathed the planet in an eerie glow. Yet, beneath the strange beauty of the alien world, Kian couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His mission was simple: find the source of the strange energy signature that had been detected by his team. But as he ventured deeper into the planet's surface, he discovered something far more extraordinary than he could have imagined. It was there that he first saw her. She stood atop a cliff, her figure illuminated by the dim light of the distant stars. Illyra. Her emerald green skin shimmered under the alien light, and her long silver hair cascaded like liquid moonlight down her back. Her violet eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Time itself felt irrelevant as their gazes locked. Kian was used to encountering strange creatures on alien worlds, but Illyra, she was different. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Illyra didn't move, yet there was an air of immense power around her. Her eyes, those deep violet pools, held knowledge beyond the stars. He felt an inexplicable pull toward her, one that tugged at the very core of his being, as if the universe itself was urging him to approach. "Who are you?" Kian finally asked, his voice steady, but filled with wonder. Illyra's voice was like a melody, smooth and ethereal. "I am Illyra," she replied, her words carrying a weight of something ancient and far beyond the confines of time. "And you, Earthling, are not meant to be here." Kian's heart raced as the gravity of her words sank in. She knew where he was from. "Why are you here?" he asked, stepping forward, drawn by an unexplainable connection. I am the keeper of the time that runs through this world," Illyra explained, her gaze never leaving his. "This planet, Ilarion, is a place where the threads of time are woven and unraveled. It is not a place for outsiders." Kian, though intrigued, couldn't ignore the curiosity that burned inside him. "But I was sent to find the source of the anomaly," he explained. "I had no idea this place was anything like this." The air between them hummed with tension, and Kian could sense the quiet strength that radiated from Illyra. You are not alone in your search, Earthling, she said cryptically. There are others who seek to control the time that binds this world. But there is more at stake than you understand. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Kian could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. There was something more, something far bigger at play. As Kian stepped closer to Illyra, he felt the pull grow stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. There was something in her presence, something that stirred an overwhelming sense of longing deep within him. His heart raced, but he couldn't tell if it was the danger of the unknown, or something far more personal. Their fingers brushed, just a fleeting moment, but it sent a jolt of electricity through him. Illyra didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes softened, and for the first time, Kian saw a flicker of vulnerability behind the fierce exterior she had presented. You are not meant to stay here, she repeated softly. But you will. For there is no escape from what you have already touched. The tension between them thickened, like an invisible force pulling their hearts closer, yet keeping them apart. Kian couldn't shake the feeling that Illyra knew far more than she was letting on. The mystery of her abilities, and the planet's strange pull on him, left him both awestruck and uneasy. As the stars above them flickered, Kian noticed something odd. A sudden distortion in the air. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the atmosphere. But then, without warning, a crackling sound filled the air, followed by a shimmering wave of light that spread out from Illyra's hand, encircling them both. Illyra's eyes narrowed as she watched the wave pulse and ripple, stretching across the sky, forming shapes and patterns that seemed to defy physics. The future, she whispered, her voice full of a gravity that Kian had never heard before, is not what it seems. Kian stood there, mesmerized and slightly apprehensive. What are you doing? He asked, his voice shaky with confusion. This is the lens, Illyra answered softly. The lens that shows the paths of the future. She closed her eyes, and the images began to form. The air shimmered as streaks of light intertwined, creating a holographic display in front of them, depicting scenes of the future. Kian watched in awe as the images flickered, showing a darkened city, a crashing ship, and the moment of his own death. His lifeless body crumpled on the cold ground. Kian's breath hitched in his chest. He staggered back, fear gripping him. Is this real? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Is this really what happens to me? Illyra did not respond immediately. She watched him closely, the weight of her knowledge bearing down on her. The future is malleable, she said slowly. But it is also dangerous. You can see it, but you cannot change it. The vision before them shifted again. This time, Kian saw himself standing beside Illyra. The two of them were standing at the edge of a cliff, gazing out at a vast, starry sky. In the distance, a massive, darkened structure, a ship or a base, Kian couldn't tell, loomed ominously. It was clear they were heading toward it. But before they could take another step, the image blurred. You're not the only one who wants to change fate. Illyra's voice cut through the tension. Others have come before you, others who sought to control time and bend the future to their will. And they failed. Kian's mind raced as he processed the warning. So, You're saying someone is trying to control time? Is that why I'm here? Illyra nodded, her gaze unwavering. Yes. The force you feel here, the pull toward me, is no accident. You were brought here because of the timeline, because someone is manipulating it. Kian clenched his fists. The idea that his arrival on this planet, his meeting with Illyra, and everything that had happened so far might have been planned made his blood run cold. Who are they? He asked. Who wants to control the future? Illyra's eyes darkened. They are not from this world. They come from another dimension, another timeline. And they have seen the future that we both will create. Her voice trailed off, and for the first time, Kian saw uncertainty in her eyes. Then how do we stop them? Kian demanded, his voice fierce with determination. He couldn't let this threat go unchallenged, not when his life, his future was hanging by a thread. Illyra stepped closer to him, her presence overwhelming. You cannot stop them by force alone. She placed a hand on his arm, sending a ripple of energy through his body, as if her touch had awakened something inside him. To stop them, you must first understand the timeline you are a part of. A new realization struck Kian. This was more than a battle of strength or will. It was a battle for control of time itself. And if they didn't act soon, everything, his future, Illyra's future, and the future of the universe would be lost. I'm ready, Kian said, determination flickering in his eyes. I'm not going to stand by and let this happen. Illyra nodded. Her expression softened, a small but meaningful gesture. Then we will fight together, she said, the weight of her words echoing in the silence. With a final glance toward the shifting sky, they turned, both knowing that the fate of everything they knew and everything they had yet to learn was now in their hands. The journey ahead was shrouded in mystery, the dark expanse of Illyrian stretching out before them. The alien world was vast, its beauty both awe-inspiring and terrifying. As Kian walked beside Illyra, the weight of her words, the warning of the time manipulators, lingered heavily in the air. It felt as though they were standing on the edge of something much larger, something beyond their control. Illyra walked with a grace that was otherworldly, her every movement fluid and purposeful. Kian couldn't help but notice how she seemed to glow under the alien sky. There was an ethereal energy about her, a presence that made everything around them seem insignificant. Yet, in her eyes, there was a depth of loneliness, a quiet sadness that betrayed the strength she projected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft rustle of the wind, carrying the scent of alien flora through the air. You said they're manipulating the timeline, Kian finally broke the silence. His voice was low, heavy with the weight of the responsibility that was beginning to settle on him. But why me? Why now? Illyra's gaze shifted to him, her eyes glinting with the faint light of distant stars. The timeline is fragile, Earthling, she began, her voice soft but firm. You were chosen because of your ability to alter the flow of time. Your presence here is not a coincidence. Kian frowned, trying to make sense of her cryptic words. But I'm just a soldier. A man from Earth. How could I possibly be part of something so profound? Illyra stopped in her tracks. Turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was an undeniable intensity in her gaze. The universe does not follow the same rules for everyone. You, Kian, are more than what you believe yourself to be. Your world may be young, but your soul is older than the stars themselves. Kian felt a strange shiver run down his spine. What do you mean by that? He asked, his heart racing slightly. He was beginning to understand that there was much more to him, and to Illyra, than met the eye. Illyra's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but she paused. Her violet eyes glimmered with a knowing light. You carry the blood of many worlds within you, Kian. Your people were once part of a great cosmic force, one that spanned galaxies and connected lives across time and space. The revelation hit Kian like a wave crashing against the shore. He took a step back, his mind reeling. That can't be. I'm just human. I don't have any connection to the stars. You are more than you know, Illyra said softly, her voice now tinged with a sense of urgency. She took a step toward him, and the air between them seemed to crackle with energy. But you will understand soon. As we venture further, you will begin to remember. Kian's thoughts swirled. Memories of his childhood, of feelings he couldn't explain, suddenly flooded his mind. Remember, he whispered. What do you mean? Before Illyra could answer, the ground beneath them trembled. The sky overhead shifted, the stars dimming for a moment, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. A low hum filled the air, and the familiar feeling of being watched washed over Kian once again. It's them, Illyra said, her voice tense. The time manipulators. They've found us. Kian's heart skipped a beat. He could sense the sudden shift in the atmosphere, there was no mistaking it. The danger was real. What do we do? Kian asked, his voice urgent. We need to reach the temple, Illyra replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. It's the only place where the timeline can be stabilized. If we don't get there soon, the fabric of reality will begin to unravel. Without another word, Illyra started moving, her swift movements carrying her effortlessly through the terrain. Kian followed, his heart pounding as he tried to keep up. The urgency in Illyra's voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. They were running out of time. As they neared the temple, a massive structure rising from the ground like an ancient relic, Kian could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. The temple was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was carved from the very rock of the planet, intricate designs etched into the surface, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. This place, Kian murmured, awe-filling his voice. It feels alive. Illyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. It is. The temple holds the knowledge of the universe. The knowledge that can stop them. As they reached the entrance, Kian looked over at Illyra. For the first time, he truly saw the weight she carried, the burden of knowing what was to come, yet still choosing to fight for what was right. We'll stop them, together. Illyra nodded, her violet eyes locking with his. Together, she echoed softly, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment. They stepped into the temple, ready to face the challenges ahead. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The journey they were about to embark on would change everything. The air inside the temple was thick with power, and ancient energy. As Illyra and Kian stepped into the grand hall, the walls seemed to hum, as if the very stones were alive, breathing the history of countless eons. Kian could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. Every step he took seemed to echo in the stillness, reverberating through his mind as though the temple was whispering to him. Illyra moved ahead of him, her silver hair trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Her violet eyes scanned the intricately carved walls, seemingly searching for something that only she could see. "What is this place?" Kian asked softly, his voice filled with awe and curiosity. Illyra didn't look back, but her voice echoed in the silent temple. "This is where time converges, where all timelines are held together. Here, the universe is written, and here, it can be rewritten." Her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. Rewritten, the idea of altering time, of changing the past and the future, seemed both impossible and intoxicating. The power of it was overwhelming. And yet, as Kian glanced at Illyra, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, a deeper, more personal connection that was beginning to form between them. He took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving her graceful figure. "Illyra," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Why do I feel like I'm supposed to be here? Like everything that's happened so far has led me to you." Illyra paused, and for a brief moment, Kian saw something flicker in her eyes. "Because you are," she said softly, turning to face him. "You are the key, Kian. Not just to the future, but to this, to me." The weight of her words hit Kian like a jolt. He had always felt like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. But standing there, in this alien temple with Illyra, it was as if the pieces of his life, of his very being, were starting to fall into place. "What does that mean?" he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Illyra took a step closer to him, her gaze fixed on his. Her presence seemed to surround him, as if the very air was charged with the energy between them. "It means," she said, her voice low and breathless, "that we are bound by something far greater than we can understand." Kian's heart skipped a beat as Illyra's words resonated deep within him. He could feel it now, the undeniable pull between them, a connection that neither of them had anticipated, but both had sensed. The tension between them was palpable, thick with the promise of something more, something that neither time nor space could explain. Without thinking, Kian reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The moment their skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through his body, unlike anything he had ever felt before. It wasn't just physical, it was a connection that went deeper, a sensation that felt like his very soul was awakening. "Kian," Illyra whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you feel it?" He nodded, his breath shallow. "Yes," he replied, his voice low and filled with wonder. "It's like I'm not alone anymore." Her eyes softened as she took a step closer to him, her lips almost touching his ear as she spoke. "You're not." The air between them crackled with energy, the electric tension between their bodies undeniable. Kian could feel his heart race faster as Illyra closed the distance between them, her body drawing near to his. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, time itself seemed to stand still. There was no past, no future, only the now. Only the undeniable connection between them. Kian could feel the heat radiating off her body, the warmth of her skin igniting something inside him that he didn't know existed. He wanted to lean in, to close the gap between them completely. But something held him back. Was it fear? Doubt? Or was it simply the sheer weight of their situation, the immense responsibility of what they were about to face? But Illyra seemed to sense his hesitation. She raised her hand to his chest, her fingers lightly brushing against his skin, sending a shiver through him. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is more than a moment. It's a bond that transcends worlds, Kian. You and I, we are part of something far bigger than either of us could ever understand." Before Kian could respond, Illyra closed the final gap between them. Her lips meeting his in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with an intensity he had never felt before. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a communion of souls, a merging of destinies. The world around them seemed to fade into nothingness. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, their hearts beating as one. In that moment, Kian understood. They were no longer just two strangers from different worlds. They were intertwined, bound by fate, time, and something deeper than either of them could comprehend. The kiss lingered, as if the very fabric of time had paused around them. In that fleeting moment, Kian felt as though nothing else mattered. There were no other worlds, no past, no future, just the undeniable pull between him and Illyra. Their connection, both physical and emotional, was more intense than anything he had ever experienced. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to bring them together, to show them that love could transcend not just time, but everything else. But as the kiss broke, reality began to creep back in. Illyra stepped back, her violet eyes still locked on his, her breath shallow and quick. "We cannot ignore what is happening," she said, her voice now tinged with urgency. Kian took a deep breath, trying to ground himself. The kiss had awakened something inside him, something deep and raw, but there was more to their mission than the undeniable attraction between them. "You're right," he said, his voice steadying. "But the tension between us, it's more than just chemistry. We're connected, Illyra. In ways I don't understand." Illyra nodded, her expression serious. "We are. But we cannot let that distract us from the reason we are here. The future is being manipulated, Kian. And if we do not act now, everything will be lost." Kian could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of the knowledge she carried. She had already been carrying the burden of this mission alone, but now, she was sharing it with him. And somehow, that made him feel both honored and terrified. "What do we do now?" Kian asked, his voice full of determination. "We go deeper," Illyra replied, her tone resolute. "The temple holds the key to stabilizing the timeline. But first, we need to understand how the manipulators are using time to control the universe." As they walked deeper into the heart of the temple, the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an almost palpable energy. The walls around them began to pulse, their intricate carvings shifting and changing, as though alive with the flow of time itself. Suddenly, Illyra stopped. Her gaze fixed on a large, glowing crystal in the center of the room. This is the heart of the timeline, she whispered. The nexus where all realities converge. It is from here that the time manipulators draw their power. Kian stepped forward, mesmerized by the glowing crystal. It shimmered with an eerie light, its surface reflecting the constellations above them. "So, this is it?" he asked. "This is what we're up against?" Illyra nodded slowly. "Yes. But there is more you need to know, Kian. The manipulators are not just altering time, they are feeding off of it. They are using the energy of the timeline to create new realities, realities where they control everything. They do not just change events, they warp the very fabric of existence." Kian felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The implications of what Illyra was saying were far greater than he had imagined. "But how do we stop them?" "We have to sever their connection to the timeline," Illyra replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We must destroy the crystal and disrupt their power. Only then can we restore the natural flow of time." Kian nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He was ready. "Let's do it," he said firmly. But as he turned to follow Illyra, a sudden flash of light filled the room. A powerful force slammed into Kian, knocking him off his feet and sending him crashing into the ground. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might lose consciousness. When he regained his bearings, he saw Illyra standing in front of him, her body surrounded by a shimmering force field. "Get up, Kian," she shouted, her voice full of urgency. "They're here." Kian scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. "Who?" he gasped, trying to understand what was happening. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, tall, shadowy beings cloaked in dark, swirling energy. "The time manipulators," Illyra said, her voice grim. "They've found us. And they won't let us stop them." The beings advanced, their forms shifting and flickering with the power of distorted time. "You cannot change fate," one of them said, its voice like the cracking of 1,000 realities. "We are the masters of time. You will bow to us, or perish." Kian stood tall beside Illyra, his fists clenched. "We'll see about that," he said, determination flooding his veins. "We're not giving up without a fight." "Then prepare yourself," Illyra replied, her eyes flashing with the power of the universe. "This battle will decide everything." The battle for time had begun. The air around Kian and Illyra crackled with energy, as the shadowy beings time manipulators surrounded them. These creatures, beings of pure, distorted energy, had one goal: to control the flow of time, and in doing so, reshape the very fabric of reality. Kian's heart raced, adrenaline flooding his veins. His training as a soldier had prepared him for physical combat, but nothing had prepared him for this war against the very essence of existence. Beside him, Illyra stood tall, her violet eyes glowing brighter than ever. She was ready. She had no fear. "We must disrupt their power," she said, her voice calm but determined. "They feed off the timeline, Kian. If we destroy the crystal, we can sever their connection to time itself." But as Illyra spoke, one of the time manipulators lunged forward, its form rippling as it shifted in and out of focus. "You cannot win," it hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers. Time belongs to us now. There is no escaping the future we have created. Before Kian could react, the creature struck, sending a shock wave of energy through the air that sent him crashing to the ground. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling around him. Kian. Illyra's voice broke through the chaos, filled with desperation. We need to keep moving. The temple is the only place where we can fight them. With a grunt, Kian pushed himself to his feet, the pain in his body numbed by the rush of adrenaline. He could feel the tension in the air. Time was literally breaking apart around them. The very ground beneath their feet trembled as if the timeline itself was starting to fracture. We can't let them win, Kian said, through gritted teeth. We've come too far. Illyra didn't respond with words. Instead, she reached out, her hand glowing with the same ethereal energy that had filled their earlier moments. She reached into the core of the timeline, drawing the power into herself, amplifying it. Together, she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. We will restore balance. The ground beneath them cracked open, and the air around them shimmered as the timelines twisted, creating pockets of fractured realities. They were not just fighting against physical opponents, they were fighting against the very nature of existence itself. The past, present, and future were colliding. Kian, focus. Illyra shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. We need to stabilize the flow of time, now. He nodded, his mind clearing despite the disorienting chaos around him. He didn't fully understand what Illyra meant, but he trusted her. What do we do? He asked, his voice steady. Illyra gestured toward the crystal at the center of the temple. We have to destroy it before they fully take control of the timeline. The crystal is the anchor to their power. Without it, they cannot manipulate time. Kian moved toward the crystal, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but Illyra stopped him. No, she said sharply. This is something only we can do. You and I, together. As Kian stood before her, the reality of their mission hit him harder than ever. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for existence itself. The future they knew, the lives they lived, were at stake. If they failed here, there would be no going back. Illyra placed her hand on his chest, her fingers pressing gently against the fabric of his suit. Do you trust me? She asked, her violet eyes searching his. With everything I have, Kian said without hesitation. I trust you. A soft smile curled on Illyra's lips. Then we will restore the balance. Together. As their hands touched, energy surged between them, a force so powerful that it sent a shock wave through the temple. The crystal before them began to glow brighter, its light shifting and pulsing with an intensity that nearly blinded Kian. Now! Illyra commanded. With a powerful thrust, Kian and Illyra channeled their combined energy into the crystal, their connection pulsing through the air as the power of the timeline clashed against them. Time itself seemed to stretch, and for a moment, Kian felt as though he were standing at the edge of infinity, his very being split between countless possible futures. But then, as quickly as it had come, the power surged. The crystal shattered. In an explosion of light and energy, the walls of the temple cracked, and the time manipulators shrieked in unison. The timeline began to stabilize, the fractures healing as the power of the crystal was released. But it wasn't over. As the crystal broke apart, Kian felt a surge of energy pulse through him. "Illyra," he shouted, turning to face her. She was standing beside him, her eyes wide, the glow of the crystal still pulsing through her body. "What's happening?" Illyra's voice was filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "The timeline, it's fighting back. The fracture isn't fully healed." Before Kian could respond, the ground beneath them trembled once again. "It's not over," Illyra whispered, her voice tinged with dread. The battle for time had only just begun. The echo of the shattered crystal still reverberated through the temple. The air was thick with residual energy, but the oppressive weight of the time manipulator's presence had faded. For a brief moment, Kian and Illyra stood in silence, breathing heavily, their minds processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The timelines, though partially repaired, were still fragile. The ripples caused by the crystal's destruction hadn't fully settled, and reality itself seemed to tremble on the brink of collapse. Kian glanced at Illyra, his eyes searching for answers. "We did it, didn't we? The crystal is gone." His voice was filled with cautious optimism, but the uncertainty in the air made him hesitate. Illyra nodded slowly, her violet eyes reflecting both relief and concern. "Yes, we stopped them, for now." Her gaze shifted, and Kian could see the weight of the situation settling back onto her shoulders. "But the damage has already been done. The timelines are fractured, and they won't be easily healed." Kian stepped closer to her, his brow furrowed. "So what now? What do we do next?" Illyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the sky above them, as if seeking answers from the stars themselves. "The universe is constantly shifting, Kian," she said quietly. "Every choice we make ripples out, affecting everything around us. The problem with manipulating time is that nothing stays the same. We are caught in a loop of choices, one decision leading to another, and another, until we are no longer in control." Kian's mind raced. He had always been a man of action, someone who made decisions quickly and acted on them. But now, standing beside Illyra, he realized how little control he had over his own fate. The timelines they had just disrupted were proof of that. "So, are you saying we can't stop the loop?" he asked. "That we're trapped?" Illyra turned back to face him, her expression softening. "No," she replied firmly. "We are not trapped. But we must be careful. Every choice we make now will shape what happens next. The more we alter time, the more we risk creating new realities that could consume us." Her words weighed heavily on him. He had always thought of himself as someone who could fix things, who could make the right decision to steer his life in the right direction. But now, with Illyra's warnings in his ears, he understood just how dangerous their mission was. They weren't just fighting time manipulators anymore, they were fighting the very concept of destiny itself. Kian looked at her, a thought forming in his mind. "But what about us, Illyra?" he asked, his voice lower than before. "What if our love is the key to breaking the loop? The question hung in the air between them. And for a long moment, Illyra didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes, as if contemplating the possibility that Kian had suggested. Her expression softened, and when she finally spoke, her voice was filled with quiet intensity. Love is the one thing that transcends all. It is the one force that cannot be controlled, cannot be predicted. It is not bound by time, nor by the constraints of fate. Perhaps it is the answer to breaking the loop. But, Kian, we must understand if we choose this path, we may have to sacrifice everything. The love we share, the time we have, everything could be erased. Kian's heart raced at her words. The stakes had never been higher. Is it worth it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Is it worth risking everything for something we might not even be able to control? Illyra met his gaze, her eyes now filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. If we don't fight for it, Kian, then what do we have left? She stepped closer to him, her hand brushing against his chest, her fingers tracing the contours of his armor. This, us, it's the one thing that gives me hope. The one thing that makes all the pain and sacrifice worth it. Kian felt the warmth of her touch, the pulse of her energy flowing through him. In that moment, everything else faded away, the danger, the manipulation, the fractured timelines. It was just the two of them, bound by a connection that neither time nor space could break. Then let's fight, Kian said, his voice steady with resolve. Let's rewrite the rules. Let's choose our own path, no matter the cost. Illyra nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Together, she whispered. And with that, they turned toward the future, toward a path that was theirs to choose. The timelines would be broken, but they would face it together, hand in hand. Whatever happened next, they would shape their destiny with love, defying the loop that sought to keep them apart. The temple was shaking. A low, rumbling sound vibrated through the ground beneath their feet, growing louder and more intense. Kian could feel it in his bones, the very fabric of reality beginning to fray at the edges. He looked at Illyra, whose expression was as steadfast as ever, yet her violet eyes betrayed a deep concern that Kian had never seen before. It's happening, Illyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. The timeline is collapsing faster than I anticipated. Kian's heart pounded in his chest. What do we do? His mind raced, trying to process the gravity of the situation. We need to stabilize it, right? We need to fix the fractures. Illyra shook her head, her expression grim. We can't fix it by force alone. The crystal we destroyed was only part of the problem. The true power lies in the rift in the timeline itself. And we have to close it? How? Kian asked, his voice desperate. He was no longer the soldier just following orders. This was a battle for something far greater. It was a fight for their love, their future, and the very existence of everything they had fought for. Illyra took a deep breath, stepping closer to him. The rift must be sealed from both sides, she explained, her voice steady. But there's only one way to do it. Kian could see the hesitation in her eyes. What do you mean? He asked. Illyra didn't speak at first. Instead, She reached into her side, pulling out a small, glowing artifact, a pendant that pulsed with the same energy as the crystal they had destroyed. "This is the key," she said softly. "It was created by the ancient civilizations of my world, a device designed to stabilize the flow of time." Kian glanced down at the pendant, his eyes narrowing. "And what do you want me to do with it?" Illyra placed the pendant in his hand, her fingers lingering on his for just a moment longer than necessary. "We need to synchronize our energy with the artifact, Kian. When we do, it will create a bond between us, a connection that can bridge the rift." "But..." She trailed off, and Kian's heart skipped a beat. "But what?" "The bond will be permanent," Illyra continued, her voice soft. "Once we close the rift, we will no longer be able to exist outside of it. We will be tied to the timeline, forever." The words hung in the air between them like a weight too heavy to bear. "So you're saying if we do this..." Kian's voice faltered. "We can never leave this moment? We'll be trapped?" Illyra nodded, her expression full of a sadness that Kian could feel deep in his chest. "Yes. But in doing so, we will restore balance. The rift will close, and the timeline will be stabilized. But, it's a choice we have to make together." Kian's mind spun as he processed the enormity of her words. His whole life had been about choice, about making the right decision. But now, faced with an ultimatum like this, everything felt different. Could he really make the decision to stay here, in this moment, with Illyra forever? He looked at her, his heart aching. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to be trapped either. What if this isn't the right choice? What if we're giving up everything?" Illyra reached out, cupping his face gently in her hands. "The future is uncertain, Kian. I can't promise you that we'll have everything we want. But I can promise you this: we will be together. We will write our own story. And that is worth fighting for." Kian closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her hands against his skin. He could feel the pull between them, a bond so deep that it transcended time itself. He had never been afraid of the unknown until now. But with Illyra, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't alone. "I'm with you," Kian said, his voice unwavering. "Let's do it. Together." The moment the words left his lips, Illyra's hands dropped to her sides, and she stepped back. The air around them shimmered as the pendant in Kian's hand began to glow brighter, casting a warm, golden light around them. The rift in the timeline began to pulse, and Kian could feel the very energy of existence beginning to bend and shift around him. Illyra reached out to him, her fingers brushing his in a fleeting moment of connection. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low and full of emotion. Kian nodded, his heart steady. "Yes." In that instant, they synchronized their energy, and the pendant pulsed with a blinding light. The energy between them surged, and the rift in the timeline began to close, the forces of time and reality swirling around them in a chaotic dance. For a moment, Kian thought everything would shatter. But then, everything stopped. The temple fell silent. The air cleared, and the pulsating light of the rift was gone. They had done it. The timeline had been restored. But at what cost? Kian looked at Illyra, his heart heavy. The world around them was still, but there was a profound change between them. They had sealed the rift, but they had also sealed their fates together forever. The temple was still. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Kian stood motionless, his hands still gripping the pendant that had sealed the rift. The blinding light had faded, and the air was calm, but a deep, unsettling quiet lingered. He turned to look at Illyra, who stood beside him, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the now still crystal. She seemed so far away, as though the weight of their actions had pushed her into a distant, unreachable place. The bond they had just forged between them through the act of closing the rift was more profound than anything Kian had ever known. Their fates were now forever tied together, beyond the realms of time and space. Kian swallowed hard. Illyra. His voice cracked as he spoke her name. What have we done? Illyra turned to him slowly, her violet eyes deep with the knowledge of the consequences. We have done what needed to be done, Kian. Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying sadness in her tone. Time will heal, but it will never be the same. Kian reached out, his fingers brushing her arm. He could feel the weight of her presence, but there was something else, a strange, pulsing energy between them. Their touch, their connection, felt almost like a living thing, something that had crossed into the boundaries of time itself. I don't know how to explain it, Kian said, his eyes searching hers. But something is different. It's like we're no longer just in the same place, but our souls are aligned. I can't describe it. It feels like I can feel everything you feel. Illyra's expression softened. You are right. She took his hand gently, her touch electric, almost like a jolt of power running through him. We have crossed into something beyond the physical. Our destinies are now bound by the threads of time. We are one now, Kian. There is no turning back from this. Kian felt the weight of her words, but more than that, he felt the reality of their situation pressing down on him. I never imagined. He paused, struggling to find the right words. I never imagined that love would do this to me. That it would break through all of time and space. But it did, didn't it? Illyra nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. Yes, she whispered. It did. And it's not just time we've defied. We've defied the very essence of existence itself. Our love is a force of nature, Kian. For a moment, Kian just stood there, holding Illyra's hand, feeling the pulse of her energy and his own beating in sync. The world around them felt distant, irrelevant. He could hear the hum of distant stars and feel the vastness of the universe stretching around them, but in that moment, it felt like everything had been reduced to this one truth: they were together. Kian's heart raced, and he felt a powerful surge of emotions that he hadn't expected. But what happens now? He asked. The timelines, they're stable, right? Illyra's eyes darkened, and she turned her gaze toward the temple's heart. They are, for now. She hesitated before continuing. But the ripples of our actions will not fade quietly into the past. There will be others who seek to challenge the bond we've created. The manipulators are not the only ones who will come after us. We have made enemies, Kian. Powerful enemies. Kian clenched his fists. I'm ready, he said. His voice was steady, filled with a determination he hadn't realized was there before. We'll face them together. Whatever it takes. Illyria turned to him, her eyes shining with pride. Together, yes. She took a deep breath, her gaze softening. But there is something more we must understand. We are now part of something much bigger than ourselves. The love we share is a force that cannot be contained, and there are those who would use it for their own purposes. What do you mean? Kian asked, his brow furrowing. Illyria sighed softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Kian, our love has become a beacon. A signal that ripples through the universe, reaching far beyond Illyrian. We are not just tied to this moment, we are tied to the very fabric of the multiverse. And there are forces out there that will seek to control it. Kian's heart dropped into his stomach. He hadn't fully understood the magnitude of what they had done. So, we're not safe. No, Illyria replied firmly. But we're stronger now. Stronger than we've ever been. Kian's gaze softened, and he reached out, cupping her face in his hands. Then we fight, Illyria. We fight for each other. We fight for the love that has changed everything. A small smile touched her lips. Yes, we do. Just as the words left her mouth, a new wave of energy pulsed through the air. Kian could feel it vibrating through his very being. It was as if the entire universe was reacting to the bond they had created. The sky above them shifted, the stars flickering as though in response to their choice. They're coming, Illyria whispered. The time manipulators and the forces that seek to control us. But we will not bend. We will not break. Kian pulled her into an embrace, feeling the warmth of her body against his, the connection between them undeniable. We will write our own fate, he said softly, the words echoing through the silence of the temple. And nothing will stand in our way. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the temple around them seemed to glow with new energy. The timelines had been disrupted, the threads of fate torn and mended, but now, there was no turning back. The love between them had transcended time, and in doing so, had become something greater than either of them could ever have imagined. The air crackled with a strange energy, unlike anything Kian had ever felt. It was as if the very core of reality itself was bending, shifting, responding to their presence. The temple was no longer still. The walls hummed with power, and the stars above them seemed to burn brighter, as though aware of what was happening below. Kian stood with Illyria, the weight of their choices hanging between them. The battle had been won, but at a great cost. Time was still fractured, the multiverse still teetering on the brink of collapse. And the forces they had defied were not going to let them walk away easily. The timeline manipulators were coming, and they were more dangerous than ever before. It's all leading to this, Illyria said quietly, her voice full of quiet strength. Her violet eyes reflected the stars, as if she could see beyond the physical world into something far greater, something that Kian could not even begin to comprehend. Kian's heart thudded in his chest. What do we do now? His voice was steady, but his mind raced, the uncertainty of their future weighing heavily on him. He had never faced something like this. The love between him and Illyra had given him strength, but now, it felt like it might not be enough. Illyra took his hand, her fingers cold against his warm skin. Now, we make the final choice, Kian. This is the moment where everything comes to a head. The rift we closed, the bond we've created, it's not just about time anymore. It's about existence itself. The timelines will never be stable until we choose how to let this unfold. We can either set the timelines free, or we can risk everything to protect what we have. But in doing so, we may condemn the future to an endless loop. Kian turned to face her fully, his grip tightening around her hand. You're saying we have to choose between love and the universe? Illyra nodded, her eyes filled with both sadness and resolve. Yes. If we continue down this path, we will be bound to this moment forever. We will live and die by the timeline we've created. But if we choose to sever our bond, to erase the connection between us, then the timelines will stabilize. The universe will be restored, but we will be lost to each other. And the love we share will cease to exist. Kian's mind reeled at the thought. But how can we do that? He could feel his breath quicken. The love between him and Illyra had transcended everything: time, space, even fate. Could he really let go of the one thing that had made him feel whole? The one thing that had given him purpose? I don't know if I can. Kian whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I can live without you. Illyra's eyes softened. Neither do I, Kian. But I know this: we have always been about more than just us. The universe is bigger than our love, and sometimes, love is not just about holding on. It's about letting go. A deep silence settled between them, as Kian processed her words. The pain of the decision clawed at him, but a part of him knew that Illyra was right. This wasn't just about them, it was about something greater. The choice they were facing wasn't just about sacrificing their love. It was about ensuring the survival of everything they held dear, even if it meant losing each other in the process. Illyra reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw. Kian, whatever happens, I will always be a part of you. Our love, this bond, we've changed the fabric of time itself. No matter where we go, or if we are separated, that will never change. Tears pricked at Kian's eyes. The depth of her words reached into him in a way he couldn't explain. He had never felt so torn in his life. The universe was waiting for them to decide, to choose whether to preserve their love or restore the balance of time. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but he knew one thing: Illyra was right. He took a deep breath, his mind clearing as he made his decision. No matter what happens, Illyra, I choose us. I choose you. Illyra's eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Then we will face it together. They turned toward the heart of the temple, where the remaining cracks in the timeline pulsed and throbbed with energy. It was a sight so magnificent and terrifying that Kian could feel the very heartbeat of the universe echoing through the room. They had come to this moment not just to save themselves, but to save everything. Together. Illyra repeated, her voice firm. Kian nodded. The power between them swelled, and in that final moment, they felt the entire universe shift in response to their decision. They had chosen. Together, they would face the consequences, whatever they might be. The timeline's fractures began to heal. The universe shuddered as the balance was restored. Kian felt the energy of the cosmos converge around them. Time, once again, began to stabilize. But in the distance, they both knew, there would always be challenges, always be forces that sought to disrupt their love. But they had chosen to fight for it. And no matter the cost, they would fight until the very end. The energy around them began to settle. The trembling of the temple faded as the timelines, once broken, began to stabilize. The force that had bound Kian and Illyria together, the cosmic bond they had created, pulsed one last time before it dissipated into the fabric of the universe. The stars above them burned brighter, the worlds beyond their reach seemingly in harmony once more. But Kian could feel that something had changed, something profound and everlasting. He stood at Illyria's side, his hand resting gently on hers. Their bond, though still strong, was no longer the overwhelming force it had once been. It was something different now, something deeper, rooted not just in their hearts, but in the very essence of time itself. "It's over, isn't it?" Kian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Illyria turned to him, her eyes soft but filled with an understanding that transcended words. "Yes. The rift is closed, the timeline restored. The universe is healing." Kian took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just happened. He looked at the stars, the ones that had once seemed so distant and unreachable. Now, they felt close, like they were a part of him. "But what about us?" Kian asked, his voice uncertain. Illyria stepped closer to him, her hand still in his. "We are not the same as we were before," she said quietly. "We have transcended time, Kian. We are no longer bound by its limitations. We are eternal." Kian's eyes widened. "Eternal," he repeated, almost as if the word itself didn't quite fit into the reality he had always known. "Yes." Illyria smiled softly, the glow of her violet eyes steady as she looked at him. "What we've created between us is more than love. It is a force that will echo through the stars, through all time and space. Our love has become a part of the very fabric of the universe." Kian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So, we're immortal." "Not immortal in the way you think," Illyria replied gently. "But our bond will live on. Through every timeline, through every reality. Our love is now a legacy, a force that will resonate with every soul that crosses time." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with a sense of finality. But it was not the end in the way Kian had feared. It was a new beginning. Kian looked at Illyria, his heart full of a love he never thought possible. The thought of losing her, of being apart from her, seemed impossible now. "So, no matter where we go, no matter what happens, we will always be together." Illyria nodded, her smile tender and knowing. "Yes, Kian. Together. We are a part of the universe now. A force that can never be torn apart." Kian felt a strange peace wash over him. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "I'm ready for whatever comes next. As long as we face it together." Illyria's fingers tightened around his. "Always, Kian. Together, forever." And as they stood there, hand in hand, the world around them seemed to fade. The timeline had been restored, but the love they shared had transcended everything. They were no longer bound by time, they had become a part of it. The stars above them glowed brighter than ever before, and the universe hummed with a quiet promise. In that moment, Kian realized that no matter what the future held, no matter what challenges they would face, their love would remain the one constant. It would echo through the ages, a legacy that would last for all eternity. The universe was vast, and they had only just begun to explore it. But now, they would explore it together forever. As the final moments of our story unfolded, I stood there, watching as time seemed to stretch between us like an endless horizon. There, in the vast silence of the cosmos, I understood something profound: love does not need an explanation. Sometimes, the things that defy logic are the ones that last forever. As we stood together, hand in hand, with the universe swirling around us, I realized that love is more than just a feeling, it's a force that transcends time, space, and everything in between. The bond we shared, the one that connected us beyond galaxies, beyond stars, it was eternal. But here's the twist: we had fought against the odds, against time itself. Yet, in the end, I came to understand that what mattered most wasn't where he came from. What mattered was the journey, the exploration of love, and where it would lead us next, together. And so, this chapter comes to a close, but is it truly an ending, or just the beginning of something far greater? Could it be that our love will lead us to more worlds, to more stories? Is love truly without limits? Will humanity search for love across the stars, or is this just a dream? Perhaps, we may never fully know the answer. But one thing is for sure, we have begun to explore it together. If you enjoyed this journey through time and space, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You'll be among the first to join us on the next adventure. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of love beyond the stars? Could it really be possible? Intergalactic hearts, we're just getting started. Like this video if you believe that love knows no boundaries, and subscribe for more adventures. Together, we'll unravel the mysteries of love, one galaxy at a time.